April 1945, somewhere along the Rhine. The war was ending, but no one felt peace. A convoy of trucks creaked to a halt beside a ruined village, engines ticking in the cold air. Inside the truck sat rows of German officers. Gray uniforms faded, insignia dulled by dust, faces locked between defiance and disbelief. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of boots and the rasp of diesel fumes. An American sergeant walked past the prisoners, his coat unbuttoned, helmet pushed back, a pack of Lucky Strikes in his pocket. He stopped beside one officer, young, exhausted, his iron cross pinned crookedly to his tunic. For a long moment neither man spoke. Then, without ceremony, the sergeant struck a match, lit 2 cigarettes, and handed one across the line of wire. The German hesitated, eyes narrowing, hand trembling, then took it. Smoke rose between them, thin and white, curling into the gray sky. No orders were given, no words exchanged. Just 2 soldiers breathing the same smoke, realizing that mercy could feel stranger than war. That quiet exchange would echo across every camp that followed. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing faster than its soldiers could comprehend. The once proud armies that had marched across Europe now staggered back toward the heart of Germany in ragged retreat. Towns lay in ashes, bridges twisted in rivers, and civilians wandered roads littered with wreckage. Every front was closing in. The Red Army from the east, the British from the north, the Americans from the west. For most German officers, the dream of victory had died months earlier, but surrender still carried the taste of betrayal. To the Americans advancing across the Rhine, the German officer corps represented both danger and paradox. Many were trained professionals, disciplined, precise, and proud of their code. Yet behind that uniformed composure lay confusion. They had been told that capture meant brutality, starvation, perhaps execution. Nazi propaganda had warned that Allied soldiers were savages who shot prisoners and mocked the defeated. The truth waiting for them on the other side of the front line was something entirely different. When American troops began taking thousands of prisoners during the Rhineland campaign, they faced a logistical nightmare. Entire divisions were surrendering, generals among them often walking toward the U.S. lines with white flags made from torn bed sheets. Within weeks, makeshift enclosures sprang up across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. Barbed wire tents and open fields became temporary prisons, holding tens of thousands of enemy officers and men. These were not concentration camps, nor even permanent facilities. They were holding grounds, built from urgency, discipline, and a quiet sense of duty. Yet something remarkable emerged in those fields of surrender. The Americans, bound by the Geneva Convention and their own cultural code, treated prisoners with an unexpected civility. They fed them adequately, provided medical attention, and enforced rules against abuse. For soldiers who had been steeped in totalitarian control and fear, this adherence to fairness was disorienting, almost unreal. German officers used to giving orders now stood in lines to receive rations from men half their age, and instead of ridicule, they were met with quiet efficiency. Cigarettes became the bridge between enemies. In a world where food was rationed and trust was scarce, a single cigarette could mean acknowledgement, an unspoken message that the man across from you was still human. American soldiers carried tobacco as casually as they carried ammunition. It was habit, ritual, and small comfort rolled into one. When they offered one to a captured German, it wasn't charity, it was instinct, a small act of equality amid chaos. For many German officers, that first shared smoke was the beginning of a different kind of shock. Letters from captured officers later revealed how deeply those first encounters unsettled them. They had expected interrogation and punishment. Instead, they met young men who spoke little German, but treated them with procedural respect. Some American units even allowed captured officers to retain small personal items, provided they posed no security risk. Watches, photographs, religious medallions, small fragments of identity survived when entire nations were burning. Behind this discipline was not sentimentality, but philosophy. American commanders understood that how they treated prisoners would shape the peace to come. To break the cycle of hatred, one had to prove that civilization still stood, even in the mud and wire of a temporary camp. And so, in places like Remagen, Koblenz, and Trier, men who had once commanded tanks and regiments found themselves seated on crates, sharing cigarettes with the soldiers who had defeated them. No propaganda had prepared them for that moment. No manual explained what it meant when the enemy extended kindness instead of revenge. The war was not yet over, but the meaning of victory was already changing. When the United States entered the Second World War, it brought with it not only industrial might, but a distinctly democratic philosophy of warfare, one rooted in law, order, and accountability. By 1943, as Axis prisoners began arriving in large numbers from North Africa, the U.S. Army had already established an intricate system for handling captured enemy soldiers. Every camp, every ration, every rule was designed to align with the 1929 Geneva Convention, which demanded humane treatment, shelter, and sustenance for prisoners of war. It wasn't generosity. It was discipline, a reflection of how the U.S. military saw itself. America's war was not just against men, but against the ideology that had stripped men of humanity. To win completely, the victors had to prove that civilization itself had survived the fire. By early 1945, as millions of German soldiers fell into Allied hands, American-run camps spread across Europe like small, orderly islands amid chaos. In France, Belgium, and along the Rhine, vast enclosures known as Rheinwiesenlager, Rhine meadow camps, held hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Conditions varied, especially in the earliest days when chaos and weather overwhelmed logistics. Yet, within weeks, U.S. Army engineers and MPs transformed these improvised fields into functioning systems: tents, latrines, mess areas, and medical zones. Even in the absence of luxury, a strange kind of order took root. Among the captured were thousands of officers, men who had once commanded regiments and divisions. To them, the notion that they would be treated fairly by their conquerors defied everything they had been taught. Nazi indoctrination had drawn a caricature of the Americans, undisciplined, mongrel soldiers of a decadent democracy. But as the days passed, that illusion began to crumble. The guards were professional, the food tolerable, the rules clear. No beatings, no public humiliation, no mock trials. Instead, there were procedures, endless paperwork, numbered tags, and clear instructions. Many of the American officers in charge of POW operations had studied international law. They knew that the eyes of the world and history were on them. The treatment of prisoners would not only reflect on the U.S. Army, but on the ideals of democracy itself. When one colonel in charge of a camp near Reims was asked why the Germans were being treated so well, his answer was simple: because we want them to remember who we are, not just what we can do. Inside the camps, cigarettes became currency, language, and olive branch. Guards offered them not out of sympathy, but as a small gesture of civility. In wartime Europe, a single cigarette was worth more than a coin. It could buy trust, trade, or a moment of silence. American soldiers, who had been supplied with rations from home, often had more than they needed. Sharing one was a way to diffuse tension, a human pause between captor and captive. For German officers accustomed to rigid hierarchy, these small acts of equality struck deeper than any speech could. A sergeant offering a cigarette to a major was, in their world, unthinkable. Yet here the lines blurred. The victor did not gloat. He followed procedure. The defeated did not beg. He adjusted to a new kind of order, one where respect was earned not through fear, but through conduct. Even German generals, men who had commanded vast armies, noticed it. In his memoirs, General Dietrich von Choltitz, the last commander of Paris, described his astonishment at the discipline of his American captors. They treated us with correctness, not malice. There was no hatred in their eyes, only exhaustion. It was as if they fought not us, but what we represented. Behind barbed wire, the lessons of democracy began to spread, not through lectures or propaganda, but through behavior. When a guard lit a cigarette for a prisoner, It was a small, wordless declaration. The war may be over, but decency is not. For German officers who had lived by loyalty to authority and obedience to fear, that realization was both humbling and profound. What they saw in those camps would haunt them long after the guns fell silent, not as cruelty remembered, but as kindness they never expected. And from that unlikely foundation, a new understanding of the enemy began to form, one that would quietly influence the rebuilding of a shattered continent. To understand why German officers were so stunned by American behavior, one must first understand the moral landscape they came from. By 1945, most German soldiers, especially officers, had spent years immersed in a system built on fear, hierarchy, and ideological indoctrination. Their world was defined by strict obedience, distrust of emotion, and contempt for weakness. Compassion was not a virtue, it was a liability. The American soldier represented the opposite of that world. He came from a democracy that valued individuality, humor, and improvisation, traits the Wehrmacht often mistook for indiscipline. When these two mentalities met across the barbed wire, the cultural collision was profound. A German officer could comprehend being beaten or mocked by his conqueror. That fit the logic of war. But to be treated politely, to be offered food and cigarettes by men he had once dismissed as inferior, that was something the Nazi worldview had never prepared him for. In countless prisoner testimonies, that moment of realization appears again and again. The first meal, the first smoke, the first kind word. A lieutenant from the 116th Panzer Division later wrote that he felt humiliation burn less from defeat than from courtesy. The Americans didn't gloat. They didn't need to. Their calm efficiency, handing out rations, enforcing order without cruelty, was itself a declaration of victory. It proved that democracy had triumphed not just through might, but through restraint. For many German officers, that shook something deep inside. Some refused cigarettes out of pride, their refusal a small act of defiance. Others accepted them silently, realizing that the gesture carried no ulterior motive. There was no attempt to humiliate, no propaganda, no staged kindness. It was simply an exchange between men who understood the rituals of fatigue. Smoke one, pass one. For a brief moment, the war disappeared in the haze. Among Americans, too, this humanity was deliberate. The Army's leadership had issued clear directives. Prisoners were to be treated fairly, regardless of rank or behavior. This was not idealism. It was policy, rooted in the belief that discipline extended beyond battlefields. To mistreat a prisoner was to dishonor the uniform, and for the men guarding those camps, farm boys, factory hands, college kids, many had no hatred left to give. They had seen too much already. Bodies in villages, camps liberated, civilians starving. The Germans in their custody were no longer symbols of evil. They were tired men who had followed orders too long. When an American soldier offered a cigarette to a German officer, it wasn't a grand gesture. It was the human instinct to recognize exhaustion in another face. But this civility also served a deeper purpose, a quiet, tactical logic shaped by the war's new reality. The U.S. command understood that the conflict had entered its final psychological phase. The fighting was ending, but the future of Europe was about to be written, and the hearts and minds of millions of Germans would determine whether the peace would hold. Every interaction mattered. Every camp, every guard, every routine of fairness was part of a broader message. America was not the destroyer the Reich had warned of. It was something different, something modern, stable, and humane. To the German officers who witnessed it, this message landed with unnerving clarity. They had spent years believing in strength through terror, a creed that had ruled their nation and shaped their own commands. Now they were faced with an enemy whose strength came from discipline without cruelty, from authority without fear. The Americans enforced order not through the whip, but through organization and calm. That realization broke more pride than bullets ever could. U.S. psychological warfare divisions even noted this effect in internal reports. The tone and behavior of American guards, they observed, carried more influence on German morale than printed leaflets or loudspeaker propaganda. Kindness, consistent, untheatrical, procedural, was the most disarming weapon they possessed. It made prisoners cooperative, reduced escape attempts, and even encouraged confessions during interrogations. But more than that, it eroded the ideological foundations of Nazism by exposing its moral bankruptcy. When German officers saw their captors acting with fairness and restraint, the myth of barbaric democracy dissolved overnight. The enemy was not a monster. The monster had been within their own walls all along. There were moments of quiet irony in this reversal. Captured officers who had once lectured subordinates about racial superiority now found themselves served by African-American U.S. soldiers, distributing rations and medical aid with professionalism. That alone shattered decades of propaganda. Some resisted acknowledging it. Others recorded it in private letters home, often with a tone of disbelief rather than anger. One German colonel, captured near Trier, wrote, "They give us food, shelter, and even tobacco. Our men are treated better here than our prisoners ever were. What kind of enemy does this?" It was a question that haunted many of them long after release. For in that question lay the beginning of moral defeat, the moment when the German officer realized that victory in war was not just about land or weapons, but about which side remembered to remain human. That realization, born not from lectures or leaflets, but from a cigarette shared across wire, marked the quiet turning point of their understanding. The Americans had fought with strength. Now they conquered with dignity. In the final months of World War II, America's victory was already secured militarily. But morally, the test had just begun. How would the victors treat the defeated? How would a nation built on freedom behave toward those who had tried to destroy it? For U.S. commanders, the answer had to reflect not vengeance, but civilization. The Germans had built an empire of terror, labor camps, executions, mass cruelty, all justified as necessary measures of war. America's duty was to prove that power could exist without cruelty, that justice did not require humiliation. When an American soldier offered a German officer a cigarette, it wasn't only an act of courtesy. It was a quiet demonstration of values. It told the prisoner, "We don't need to hate you to have defeated you." That idea carried immense moral weight, because the true difference between totalitarianism and democracy lay not in how they fought their enemies, but in how they treated them afterward. In interviews and memoirs written after the war, many captured Germans described this precise shock. They could understand being beaten or starved. That fit the narrative of conquest. What they couldn't comprehend was restraint. To be defeated without being degraded was almost harder to process than the defeat itself. It was as if America had stripped them not of dignity, but of justification. Their belief that they had fought for survival against barbarism had evaporated, replaced by a new, uncomfortable truth. They had been fighting the more civilized army all along. The moral strength of America's conduct became its quietest weapon. It dismantled Nazism not through punishment, but through example. In the 1940s, American soldiers carried more than rifles and rations. They carried culture. Even amid destruction, the American way of life, casual, open, pragmatic, found expression in small acts. A GI could land in Normandy, fight through France, and still make time to joke, share, and smoke. This cultural ease came from a society that valued informality and equality. Rank mattered, but humanity came first. The German officer corps was the opposite. Their system thrived on distance. Rigid ranks, formal titles, obedience above all. The idea that a sergeant could speak casually to a colonel, let alone share a smoke, was inconceivable. That distance was the foundation of control. So when captured officers saw young American guards addressing them with simple, unafraid confidence, sometimes even with a grin, it was deeply unsettling. They expected hatred, and instead found normalcy. They expected domination, and instead found routine. And in that reversal, the moral universe of Nazism began to crack. To the Americans, sharing cigarettes wasn't a policy. It was instinct. Cigarettes were social currency, traded, offered, and shared across every level of society. They were how men said, "I understand," when words failed. On the battlefield, They were a bridge between fear and courage. In captivity, they became a bridge between conqueror and conquered. Photographs taken in 1945 often show this silent ritual: GIs leaning casually on fences, smoke curling between helmets, while captured officers sit quietly nearby. No propaganda, no ceremony, just humanity surviving in the simplest gesture. A pack of lucky strikes, a flick of a match, a few seconds of eye contact. In that small exchange, the moral lines of war blurred, revealing something older and deeper: the soldier's code of respect for another man who had faced the same fear. The Nazi regime had built its power on dehumanization. From the earliest years, it trained its citizens, especially its officers, to see mercy as weakness. Compassion was portrayed as treason to the state. This conditioning made surrender not only shameful, but psychologically devastating. To be captured was to be stripped of identity. Yet for many German prisoners, their first days in American custody began the slow unwinding of that conditioning. They were no longer heroes of the Reich, nor animals in an enemy's cage. They were simply men again. And that transformation began not with grand speeches, but with gestures so small they almost went unnoticed. A guard who used the word "sir," a medic who treated a wound carefully, a cigarette offered without judgment. For some, it was the first humane act they had witnessed in years. For others, it triggered guilt, a painful awareness that they had been part of a system incapable of such decency. Psychologists studying post-war testimonies noted that many POWs experienced what they called disorientation through kindness. The enemy's humanity forced them to confront their own inhumanity. In time, that disorientation evolved into reflection. Many officers later credited their time in American camps as the beginning of their moral rehabilitation, a process that would influence West Germany's post-war democratic culture. The seeds of that transformation were not planted in classrooms or tribunals, but in muddy fields where a guard and a prisoner shared the same smoke in silence. Even years later, former German officers wrote about it with astonishment. Colonel Hans-Ulrich Rudel, a decorated Luftwaffe pilot, admitted that what struck him most about his capture was not the defeat, but the calm of the Americans. They did not shout. They did not mock. They treated him as a man, not a monster. It was this civility, he said, that disarmed the spirit more than any weapon. The gesture of sharing a cigarette was simple, almost trivial. Yet in that moment, repeated countless times across hundreds of camps, something profound happened. A culture of obedience met a culture of liberty, and in the brief spark of tobacco and smoke, one began to understand the other. It was a lesson neither side would forget. For the Germans, it marked the beginning of humility. For the Americans, it reaffirmed why they had fought, not merely to win a war, but to prove that even after the worst of humanity, decency could still prevail. May 1945. The guns had fallen silent, but the shock of peace had not yet begun to settle. Across the Rhine, hundreds of thousands of captured German soldiers now lived behind American barbed wire. For the first time in 6 years, they no longer took orders from Berlin. Their war was over, but understanding it would take much longer. Among these camps stood one that came to symbolize the strange civility of victory: a makeshift enclosure near Remagen, Germany. Once a battlefield, it now held thousands of Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe officers. The landscape was still raw: shell craters, broken trees, half-buried vehicles. Yet within that ruin, a new order emerged. American MPs patrolled the fences, disciplined but calm. There was no shouting, no mockery. Each day ran like clockwork. Roll call, meals, medical checks, lights out. War's chaos replaced by quiet procedure. The German officers watched all this in stunned disbelief. They had expected degradation, the vengeance of the victors. Instead, they found structure, routine, even respect. The Americans demanded obedience, yes, but they enforced it with professionalism, not hatred. When fights broke out among prisoners, the guards intervened, not with violence, but with words, warning, and method. There were rules, and everyone, even the victors, followed them. For officers raised in a culture of domination, this discipline without cruelty felt like a contradiction. The Americans were young, often casual in their posture, their uniforms slightly rumpled, yet they carried an authority that came not from fear, but from self-control. They didn't need to shout to be obeyed. Their confidence was quiet, and therefore more powerful. One afternoon, the camp routine paused for something unscripted. A convoy had arrived carrying wounded German prisoners from the front, officers and enlisted men alike. American medics began unloading them, some on stretchers, others barely walking. Nearby, a group of captured German officers watched silently as their countrymen were treated by the very enemy they had fought only days before. A U.S. Army sergeant, tired, dust-covered, barely older than 20, noticed one of the German officers sitting apart, his arm in a sling, his uniform still bearing the insignia of an elite division. The young man's face was pale, his pride clearly intact, his eyes full of confusion. The sergeant, after a pause, reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, and held it out. The officer hesitated, unsure whether to accept. For him, such an exchange had no precedent. But then, almost instinctively, he took it. The sergeant struck a match and lit both. No words were spoken. No photographers, no witnesses, just two soldiers sitting on opposite sides of history, sharing smoke over the wreckage of Europe. That simple act spread through the camp like a quiet rumor. By evening, men who had once saluted Hitler were whispering about the strange decency of their captors. Some dismissed it as manipulation. Others felt a deeper discomfort. It wasn't propaganda. It was reality breaking through indoctrination. The enemy they had been taught to fear was now the first to treat them as men again. In later interviews, several German officers would recall that precise moment, not the day they surrendered, but the day they realized the moral order of the war had reversed. The Americans had fought with power. Now they ruled with restraint. That contrast left a deeper wound than any defeat on the battlefield. For the Americans running those camps, this civility was no accident. Behind every gesture lay policy and philosophy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had made it clear the United States would not emulate the cruelty it fought to end. The U.S. Army was to remain a force of law, not vengeance. In his orders, Eisenhower emphasized the preservation of order, discipline, and humanity. That phrase would echo through every POW facility under American command. To the Germans, it was a revelation and a mirror. They had lived in a world where power existed only through fear. Now they saw a system where power was controlled by principle. It was unsettling, even humiliating, to realize that the enemy's restraint exposed their own corruption. The officer corps, long convinced of their cultural superiority, found themselves learning from the very soldiers they had been taught to despise. As the sun set that evening over the Remagen camp, the air filled again with cigarette smoke, faint, rising between fences, curling through the twilight. The officers sat quietly, talking in low tones about what they had seen. They no longer spoke of honor or victory. They spoke of order, decency, and strange respect. The humiliation of defeat remained. But something else had begun to take its place. Reflection. For the first time in years, many of them could think without fear of reprisal, without ideology shouting over conscience. It was in captivity, not in command, that they began to see what the war had truly cost, not only in blood, but in moral ruin. And through it all, the Americans kept doing what they had done from the start, following orders, maintaining order, and lighting cigarettes, not because they sought forgiveness, but because civilization, even amid victory, required reminders that humanity had survived. In the weeks that followed the German surrender, word of America's conduct traveled faster than any broadcast. It passed quietly from camp to camp, carried in whispers, letters, and the shared memories of men who could no longer fight. From Remagen to Koblenz, from the makeshift enclosures in France to the great transport ships bound for the United States, the story repeated itself. The Americans do not hate us. They treat us correctly. They even share their cigarettes. To those who had lived under a regime that glorified cruelty, That rumor seemed impossible, and yet it was true. The enemy that Nazi propaganda had painted as a nation of mongrel degenerates turned out to be calm, structured, and strangely kind. What began as disbelief turned over time into quiet introspection. For many German officers, that shift would prove more transformative than the surrender itself. As the Allied occupation solidified, captured officers were transferred from European camps to permanent facilities across the Atlantic. Oklahoma, Texas, and Georgia became unlikely homes for thousands of former enemies. The U.S. government had built more than 500 POW camps on American soil. Clean, organized, and surprisingly self-sufficient. Prisoners worked on farms, helped with construction, and were paid modest wages in camp currency. The daily routine was strict but fair. Roll call, meals, labor, education, recreation. It was there, on the far side of the ocean, that many German officers finally began to process what they had witnessed at the front. In Kansas and Alabama, they were offered English classes. In Georgia, some were given books by Mark Twain and Lincoln biographies. Others were invited to attend lectures about democracy and world affairs. These weren't propaganda sessions. They were introductions to another way of thinking. A former Wehrmacht colonel later recalled in his memoir, "At first, I thought it was a trick, to make us forget who we were. But slowly I realized it was the opposite. They wanted us to remember that we were still men." Inside those quiet, ordered camps, an unlikely moral education unfolded. The Americans didn't preach democracy. They lived it, through routine, fairness, and trust. Guards and prisoners often developed a strange mutual respect. When work details finished, it wasn't uncommon for a GI to light a cigarette and hand one to a German officer beside him. A shared silence replaced the sound of marching boots. For the men who had built their identity on obedience, it was the first lesson in freedom they had ever experienced. U.S. officials understood the value of this transformation. The War Department had concluded that humane treatment produced not only compliance, but long-term ideological benefit. Officers who returned home with respect for their captors could become stabilizing forces in a defeated Germany. That was not sentiment. It was statecraft. To win the peace, America needed not only to rebuild Germany's cities, but its conscience. And for that, the camps became classrooms. Officers who once commanded armored divisions now organized choirs, wrote camp newspapers, or took part in debate clubs discussing democracy and ethics. The more they engaged, the more they questioned what they had believed. The memory of that first shared cigarette, a moment of decency in the chaos of defeat, lingered as a symbol. It represented something their own system had never offered them: respect without fear. One U.S. guard in Oklahoma later wrote in his journal, "They stopped looking at us like enemies after a while. They started asking questions. Real questions. Not about the war, but about life here. About why our sergeants talk to captains like equals. About why we're not afraid of our officers." You could see it in their eyes. They were learning what freedom looks like. That process, quiet and personal, was more powerful than any speech. By 1946, as repatriations began, many returning German officers carried with them a conviction that democracy was not weakness. It was strength, the kind of strength that could build rather than destroy. The seeds of West Germany's post-war transformation, its discipline, its civic order, its moral humility, were planted in those moments of decency behind American fences. Historians often measure victory in land gained, enemies killed, or cities conquered. But in the years after 1945, another kind of triumph emerged, one less visible but far more enduring. The United States had not only defeated Germany's military, it had disarmed its spirit of cruelty. This was not achieved by propaganda or punishment, but by consistent humanity. The image of the American soldier, relaxed, fair, unafraid to show kindness, stayed with the prisoners long after they returned home. It haunted their memories more than any battlefield loss, because in that humanity lay the proof that the Reich had been wrong about everything. About strength, about race, about civilization itself. For many German officers, That realization began not with the Nuremberg trials, but in the simple act of being treated as human beings by their captors. The cigarette became a symbol they never forgot. Small, burning, fragile, and fleeting, like the civilization they had nearly destroyed, but now saw reflected in their enemies' hands. The war had ended, but its meaning was still unfolding. For the Americans, the battle for the moral future had just begun. For the Germans, the lessons of decency learned in captivity would outlast the ashes of defeat. By 1946, the great reversal of war was complete. The Reich was gone, its cities reduced to ash, its leaders awaiting judgment at Nuremberg. Across 2 continents, more than 3 million German prisoners were scattered in Allied custody. Among them, the officers who had once commanded armies now stood in lines to board ships home, their uniforms replaced by simple work clothes, their decorations confiscated, their pride left behind in the dust of defeat. But they carried something unexpected with them, a memory that refused to fade. Not of battle, not of loss, but of discipline and mercy. Of young American soldiers who had treated them, not as monsters, but as men. For most returning officers, the journey home began in silence. The ships that left from New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans carried men who no longer resembled conquerors. They were thinner, quieter, and more introspective. In the barracks of the transport ships, conversations drifted between disbelief and reflection. Many spoke of how the Americans had behaved, how their captors had enforced rules with calmness, not rage. For men trained to obey through fear, that memory felt almost spiritual. When they arrived in a ruined Germany, the contrast was overwhelming. The homeland they had left years earlier was unrecognizable. Bombed-out cities, shattered families, and moral exhaustion everywhere. The propaganda that had once painted the Allies as brutal conquerors now lay in ruins beside the Reich itself. And the officers who had seen America with their own eyes began quietly correcting the myths. In taverns, churches, and gathering halls, they told others what they had seen. They spoke of order and fairness, of camps where men were fed, paid, and even educated. They spoke of American guards who saluted back when greeted properly, of sergeants who enforced rules without hatred, of simple acts like lighting cigarettes or sharing bread. For listeners still haunted by fear and humiliation, those stories sounded impossible. Yet they were true. These returning officers were no longer the same men who had once commanded with iron precision. The war had stripped them of illusion, but captivity had taught them something new, that authority could exist without terror. Many brought this realization into civilian life. When West Germany began rebuilding under Allied supervision, former officers often found themselves in positions of local responsibility: administrators, teachers, engineers, and in their conduct, subtle traces of what they had learned in captivity began to appear. They valued order, but not oppression. They demanded discipline, but not silence. And they spoke with a quiet respect for the idea, once unthinkable, that strength could come from fairness. Historians studying post-war Germany often overlook these men, seeing them as remnants of a defeated army. But beneath the surface, they played an unseen role in moral reconstruction. Their first-hand experience of American discipline and decency had given them a living example of what a just society could look like, one where authority was bounded by law, and where even enemies were treated with dignity. In the following years, memoirs and diaries written by former POWs began to surface. Many shared the same recurring image: a cigarette exchanged across barbed wire, or an American soldier offering food without insult. That image became a personal shorthand for everything they had learned: restraint, respect, and a different kind of strength. One former Luftwaffe officer, writing in 1948, confessed, "It was not defeat that humbled me. It was the correctness of our captors. In their discipline, I saw what we had lost long before the war ended." Those words captured a truth that Germany would slowly rediscover through reconstruction: that civilization is not measured by power, but by how power is used. The lessons that began in the dust of American prison camps would echo through the political and moral rebirth of the Federal Republic. For the Americans, this was never a planned experiment. They hadn't intended to shape minds or philosophies, yet through routine and fairness they did. They proved that victory rooted in mercy could plant deeper change than any punishment ever could. And for the Germans who lived it, the war did not end when they laid down their weapons. It ended the day they realized that civilization had survived its own destruction. By 1947, most German prisoners held in America had been repatriated. They returned to a homeland divided between victors, half occupied by the Soviets, half under Western control. The psychological contrast between those zones was immediate. Men who came back from Soviet captivity brought tales of brutality, hunger, and revenge. Those returning from the United States spoke of rules, order, and dignity. The difference was not lost on anyone. Within Germany's ruined towns, families gathered to hear the returning officers speak. They had seen the enemy up close, and the enemy had not been the monster the Reich had promised. Instead, they spoke of something far more disarming. Americans who smiled, joked, followed rules, and treated them as equals in humanity, if not in victory. These accounts spread quietly, but steadily. In schools and churches, among local councils rebuilding civic life, the men who had experienced fair treatment abroad became advocates for moderation. They had seen a working democracy, and they knew it functioned not by fear but by principle. In the chaos of occupation, these voices carried weight, not because of ideology, but because they came from those who had once believed in the opposite. A former Wehrmacht major who had spent 2 years in an Oklahoma camp later wrote, "In their prisons, we learned freedom, not through words, but through the way they lived their rules." That paradox, freedom learned in captivity, became one of the quiet foundations of West Germany's post-war identity. The newly formed Federal Republic would adopt not only American economic aid through the Marshall Plan, but also elements of American civic order. Local governments emphasized transparency and accountability. Law replaced fear. Responsibility replaced blind obedience. These values, now woven into German Reconstruction, had their roots in the experience of seeing America's discipline firsthand. As the Cold War began, the United States recognized the significance of this transformation. Former POWs who had respected their captors became invaluable intermediaries, men capable of fostering trust between two nations that had once slaughtered each other. The U.S. military government quietly encouraged these former officers to help rebuild local administration and police forces, knowing that their first-hand respect for American order made them natural allies for democracy. When American advisors toured post-war Germany in 1948 and 1949, they often noted something unexpected. Discipline remained strong, but cruelty had diminished. The old German precision had survived, now tempered by humility. It was a fusion of two traditions, German efficiency and American fairness, born, ironically, in the fenced enclosures of wartime captivity. Cultural reconciliation soon followed. By the early 1950s, American and German veterans groups began holding meetings and memorials together. Cigarettes and coffee, the very symbols of humanity in captivity, reappeared as tokens of friendship at these gatherings. The gesture that had once crossed barbed wire now crossed nations. When the Federal Republic joined NATO in 1955, many of the senior officers in its new army, the Bundeswehr, were men who had experienced American captivity firsthand. They carried with them a new doctrine, authority rooted in ethics, not ideology. Their field manuals spoke of innere Führung, inner leadership, a concept that emphasized moral responsibility alongside discipline. That philosophy was a direct descendant of lessons learned in U.S. camps, that decency is not weakness, and that obedience must never silence conscience again. Looking back, historians would come to see these years not only as Germany's physical reconstruction, but as a moral reawakening. The cigarette shared across wire in 1945 had become a metaphor for the peace that followed, fragile, humane, and built on understanding rather than dominance. America had demonstrated something no treaty could capture, that civilization's greatest victory lies not in destruction, but in restraint. In 1953, An American veteran who had served as a POW guard wrote in a letter to his old unit, "We didn't know we were teaching them anything. We were just doing our jobs. But maybe that was the lesson." And he was right. Without lectures, without sermons, America had modeled a kind of strength that reshaped its former enemies. It proved that power governed by principle could rebuild even those it once defeated. By the time the German-American Friendship Pact was signed in the 1950s, the echoes of that wartime decency were still alive, not in monuments or speeches, but in memories of shared cigarettes, quiet fairness, and the unspoken dignity of men who discovered that mercy, once shown, never truly fades. In the end, history often remembers the thunder, the battles, the weapons, the ruins. But sometimes its truest moments live in silence, in the small gestures that outlast the noise. In the spring of 1945, when a tired American sergeant handed a cigarette to a defeated German officer, he wasn't making history. He was simply being human. Yet, in that act, a generation found its mirror. For the Germans who lived it, that kindness carried a weight far greater than the smoke itself. It was the moment they saw what the war had stolen: decency, restraint, respect. The Reich had promised greatness through fear. The Americans revealed strength through fairness. That realization struck deeper than defeat ever could. It taught that civilization's power is not measured by its ability to destroy, but by its refusal to abandon mercy when it holds the advantage. For the Americans, too, that moment mattered. They had faced a choice every conqueror must face, whether to rule through vengeance or through law. They chose law. They chose humanity. And in doing so, they preserved the very ideals they had crossed an ocean to defend. The story of those cigarettes is not about tobacco or ritual. It is about civilization surviving its darkest hour. In the ashes of empire amid fences and fatigue, men discovered that decency was still possible, even after everything. The smoke that rose between them that day drifted upward, thin and white against the gray of a broken sky. It carried no flag, no rank, no hatred, just the faint proof that even in victory, the human heart can still remember how to be kind. And that, more than any battle, any medal, or any speech, was how the war truly ended.